Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have an incredible episode, but it's also maybe a controversial episode. I can already see a lot of people getting upset about what I'm going to say. It may be too nuanced for you and too beyond the pale for a lot of people what I may be talking about today. And the subject we're going to be talking about is Russia. We need to talk about Russia because this is a big news story that is going on in the world. I had some other ideas that I wanted to talk about, but I feel that this is going to be such a splash of cold water that I don't want to infuriate the audience too much. So it's primarily going to be about Russia. Then we're going to have some white pills about the domestic political situation in America before moving on. But we're going to talk about Russia because they're very much in the news again. Unless there are two big news items from last week from Russia. One, Nordstream pipelines were blown up by a mysterious actor. I wonder who could have done that. And second, Russia formally announced it was annexing 4 territories in Ukraine. They've already annexed Crimea, so that would be 5 territories that were part of Ukraine prior to 2014 that are now a part of Russia, at least according to Russia. So these are big news events and, really escalate the conflict. So we need to analyze both and also go into the situation of the war itself, how we should view Russia, how we should view the war, and where we move from here. How do we consider geopolitics in light of these current events? So we're first going to go with the Nord Stream pipelines exploding off of the coast of... Well, it's in between Sweden and Denmark. I think it's off one of the islands. I forget if it's next to Denmark or Sweden. Once again, not showing my thorough news knowledge, but it was very much closer to the west than it was to Russia. Multiple sections of both pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, exploded, started leaking. Big damage. Russia and the Western corporations that have been working with had spent billions upon billions of dollars doing this. This is a major economic investment in Russia, even though Nord Stream 2 never went into effect due to the war in Ukraine. But the Nord Stream pipelines are a significant leverage for Russia, and now they're at the bottom of the Baltic. They're not going to be there. They're not going to be much use for Russia or using leverage because now they're going to have to spend a lot of money to repair it, and who's going to spend that money when all the Europe is saying that we don't want to be a part of Russia, or we don't want to have anything to do with Russia anymore. We're sanctioning Russia, and Russia is probably not going to be allowed to repair it under the current circumstances. So who benefits from this? And why is everyone blaming Russia? Because the rush to judgment is that it's Russia. And when this initially happened, all the libtards and other people and the prominent Polish politician who's married to Anne Applebaum, has served as a minister in previous governments, thanked America. Everyone's like, Dark Brandon doing it again. Dark Brandon telling Russia what it's about. This is awesome. America definitely did this. And then over time, they're like, actually, it's a conspiracy theory to blame America. Like, how could anyone blame America? It's obviously Russia. And the reasoning for it being Russia is incredibly thin. I read at least 3 or 4 articles looking because I was like, I'm an open-minded guy. I'm a free thinker. I want to see what the other side is saying. My first impression is like, I'm pretty skeptical of this claim, but maybe there's some good arguments for why Russia did it. Sure enough, there are no arguments for Russia did it. There was a Fox News article, like 5 reasons that Russia would do this. One is to intimidate Europe. It's like, they're blowing up their own infrastructure to intimidate. It'd be like Russia having a building next to Estonia and then it blowing it up and like, see what we can do. And it's like, well, okay, you're blowing up your own shit that benefits you to intimidate us. What's that? And then it's like, well, they wanted to have leverage, saying that they're not going to have any more oil. Russia is already withholding the oil, and they wanted the Nord Stream pipelines to be back in service so they could have an economic benefit for them. They were going to gain billions and billions of dollars every year due to the pipeline, and now they're not at all. And there's not even even though they had been halted before, there's a potential that, the winter is so bad for Europe that they're like, okay, let's get these pipelines back up and running. Let's get the full energy supply going. And now they're cutting them off. And also, the Nordstream pipelines were important because they bypassed all these hostile Eastern European countries that Russia doesn't have good relations with and wants to be as tough as possible on Russia. And now they're going to have to go back to those sources to go through, and those countries are going to have much more of leverage over Russia and Europe in what they try to do, because now their energy supply is not just dependent on Russia, it's also dependent on Eastern Europe, where these sources are going through. So those arguments just don't make any sense. And it's, they're like, they have the capacity to do that. That's probably true. But why would they do that? And also, it was in enemy territory. They would have to go, this is a pretty risky mission where they'd have to go all the way to close to the shorelines of these areas where there's U.S. patrol boats, there's all Danish, all these Swedish, there's all these people who are very hostile to Russia. They'd have to go there undetected, do their shit and get it done. And it's like, well, why? They have a pipeline that's much closer to them that they could have easily just blown up. I mean, obviously, if they had done that, that would have been clearly that they're the culprit. So what are the reasons? And there's a Time magazine article that definitively declared that this is an all-out energy war declared by Russia. And then you're like, well, what is the reason for Russia doing this? And it has a paragraph. It's like, on the surface, it doesn't make any sense that they would blow it up. But there are two reasons. It's like, one, they wanted to do a false flag operation to blame America and to cut Europe off from America and Ukraine. And it's like, well, I mean, that's the only logical explanation, is that they would do this to harm themselves in order to blame America, but they would also hurt themselves significantly in doing so. And it carries a lot of great risks that had been easily found out, that those soldiers or sailors or whatever that they were using to go and sabotage the pipelines were captured. Why would they go through all that risk to just carry out a false flag operation? Also, they have to be enough awareness to know that Europe will believe anything America tells it, and Europe is totally dependent on America. It is a vassal state to the globalist American empire. Even if they did do this, and somehow there's no way that they could convince them that this was America, and we'll go to that in a moment with America's response. The other theory is that it was meant to distract attention from the annexations in Ukraine, which it failed completely. There's not oh wow, we're so focused on Nord Stream. Whoa, Russia annexed some of Ukraine? Wow, we just didn't notice. Both things were given equal attention in the news cycle. So these people don't even have legitimate reasons. They're like, well, the consensus is the only thing they have is the foreign policy and intelligence service consensus is that Russia blew up its own pipelines. And you have to remember is that this same intelligence community had the same consensus that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, wasn't real. That turned out to be complete bullshit. It's the same with the Russian election interference in 2016. The consensus was that Russia interfered in our elections. Total bullshit. Intelligence community consensus about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. That was their consensus then. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And this is clearly just lying because they know Europe will accept our lies. Thinking about all the lies that have been going on in Ukraine, which I'm not just going to focus on, I'm going to focus on both sides, but I want to focus on more the West and Ukraine's because that is what we're receiving more of for the general population. There's been so many lies from the ghost of Kiev. There was the woman an old lady who somehow took down a drone with a pickle jar. There's been the lies that Russia has been shelling its own POW camps and its own fucking cities. And people just believe that. They're like, oh, well, we need war crimes charges for Russia shelling its own cities. It's and its own POW camps. Who the hell is doing this? It's not the Russians. Russians are not bombing themselves. This is saying that Pearl Harbor was done by the United States Air Force. Okay, no, it was done by Japan. This is how idiotic people are, and they all believe it because they're worried about getting censored. And so when we're looking at this, if the only possible theory is the false flag one, because it is so obvious in America's interest to do this. And it's so obvious that only America or one of its allies, maybe Poland or somebody else, would have wanted to do this because it benefits American foreign policy. It benefits Eastern Europe, or the anti-Russian segment of Eastern Europe. And that's who apparently benefits. Who's hurt the most? Germany or the rest of the continental Europe that depends on this energy supply, and Russia. Russia does not gain from what it may gain from a false flag operation versus the cost to them of doing this. I think it's lopsided. And I think America is so brazen and confident that it can continue to humiliate Europe and make Europe do what it wants, and Europe can't complain. So they just said, we're worried about the Nord Stream pipelines continuing to exist. This may turn out to be something that Germans are aware of, that they could be fired up again, still pump energy, and we may lose Europe. And keeping them on Team America when it comes to Ukraine, then let's just blow it up. And look, Europeans are going to believe whatever bullshit we feed them. And sure enough, that's what's happening here, is that America's going out saying it's conspiracy theory to blame America, and Europeans are probably going to investigate, and they're going to conclude it's Russia, and they're going to place more sanctions on Russia, and America's going to keep winning. I mean, this whole war has been a massive victory for the globalist American empire. It's, and people are like, that's not true. Like, Russia's gained some territory. I mean, it's not been good for Ukraine. It's not been good for Europe. And Russia has had some small victories, and they still may have a small victory in the future. But the real great victory is for America. America, I mean, for the cost of billions of dollars, which I don't think we can afford, and I think we should not give. But take this from the perspective of the people running this country and the establishment and the globalist American empire, is that they view Russia as a major threat, if not the major threat to American global hegemony. And so just with the cost of a few $1 billion, they are able to get Putin bogged down in a quagmire that could potentially lead to regime change. I'm still skeptical of that moment, but depending on how this war goes, those chances continue to increase, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. It has ensured Europe is even more loyal to us and is not going to be doing business with Russia. And pretty much we now have greater control of Europe, and we can tell them what to do, and they're more dependent on us, both militarily and economically than ever before. Russia's in a weaker state. It's now, doesn't have the ability, it still has leverage over Europe, but it does not have the ability to manipulate Europe as it did before. And it no longer is able to intimidate Ukraine as it was before. And yes, it's in a war with Ukraine, but Ukraine before this war was still intimidated by Russia, did not want to get into a war with Russia, was very worried about an invasion, was worried that its military may collapse and may go over to the other side. All that has been disproven. They have a military that's at least capable of defending a lot of the country. It maybe doesn't have the capacity to retake back territory that it had pre-2014, or even what a lot of the territory that Russia's taken in this war. But they have a military that's not going to collapse upon Russian invasion and can stand up for itself. And not only that, they know that the West will be on its side, which they were worried that the West may abandon them. They may not want to give them the billions of dollars that they demand and all that stuff. And that Europe may try to make a deal with Russia. They now no longer have to worry about that. So they're not as intimidated by Russia as before. There's still a little, there's clearly a bit of intimidation because they're in a very deadly and bloody war with them. But the type of fear that Russia could easily steamroll them and impose a new regime and their military couldn't do anything to stop them, I think that this fear has been dispelled. And America just counts another victory with the Nord Stream. And our leaders, even though they're all blaming Russia and they're like, oh, this is so bad, they're open about Secretary of State Blinken is talking about, well, we have a lot of great opportunities with this, even though Russia totally did this. But look on the bright side, it's really good for us. And it's like, that's weird that Russia would do something to hurt us, but it's actually really beneficial to us. That makes you think. And then Biden and other people were saying, we'll end Nord Stream one way or another. And also I think America just had more incentive here. If you use fact and logic, if you use just reason looking at this, and if you look at all the arguments, like I was open to this, I wanted to see arguments for why Russia would have done this. And The arguments aren't there. The arguments aren't there. While the arguments for America are just completely there. The only argument that it wouldn't have been America is that it was too brazen. It may be seen as an act of war, or it may alienate Europe, but I think America is so confident in itself and so cocky that it can just say, we did this, we blew it up, but it was Russia, and you're going to believe us, and Europe has no choice but to believe them. In any case, the European population is so psyoped by all the propaganda that's coming out. I mean, these people still believe Ghost of Kiev and all the other crap that came out. And they're just simply just going to nod their heads and go along with it. And so it is like a huge coup for America. Even if Russia did end up doing it, it's still a major win for America, and it's a very idiotic decision by Russia. Like, I could argue that there's still some chance of Russia. Like, the Russians have done a lot of idiotic things in this war, and maybe they just really wanted to punish Europe and just say, you're not going to get any more gas, like, fuck you. Or they thought that maybe a false flag operation would work and they're so desperate. Or there's just rogue elements who just did this. Maybe. I don't, but I mean, maybe a 5% chance. I would say a 5% chance. 95% chance America or one of its allies. And this is just seen through simple deduction. Or simple clarity in looking into this case and seeing who benefits and asking who benefits. Russia doesn't really benefit. We greatly benefit, and Europe does not benefit at all, or at least Western Europe. I mean, Poland benefits, but Poland wouldn't do this without getting American approval. So, but maybe, there was a wink and a nudge to Poland, and it's like, oh, well, wouldn't it be terrible if that happened? And Poland just went ahead and did it. I mean, it wasn't too far off from where Poland is, so maybe Poland could have done it with some type of tacit approval by America, and America can't say, well, look, we didn't do it. It was Poland. It wasn't us. It was somebody else. And so it's somebody, I think it's most likely one of either America or one of its allies. And I think most reasonable people should see that. But that doesn't change from what the clear pill I'm going to deliver later on in this podcast about the war. And I'm going to go into that with the Russian annexation. Is that last week Russia had a big ceremony to announce that it was annexing 4 territories in Ukraine, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, and another one that I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce its name. It's like starts with a Z. I'm not going to pronounce. Maybe I'll get Urku Channon or one of those guys to come on here and to pronounce it. And announced it in a big ceremony, and Putin gave a big speech on this matter. And this speech was a bit weird. I noticed that it was very different from past speeches. A lot of speeches, especially when Putin was giving at the beginning of the war, he's very confident, had very control. He's going very rational, going through the reasons for the invasion and why they're doing this. And it seemed like somebody in control of the situation. This speech was instead very shrill, especially in its rhetoric. Its rhetoric was all over the place, very wild, very much coming from a person who is very much wounded by the West and has a real grievance against the West. I mean, I understand why with Putin, but I'm just saying that this is what it sounded like. And it seemed that the entire West is his enemy. And there were some interesting parts. There was I think he talked about mass migration being a problem. And he also talked about how there's this satanic mindset in the West that wants to do, change children's gender and sexualize them, and that Russia will never allow that. And I think most American conservatives would agree with that stuff. But then there was a very disturbing part, and I think the most disturbing is like seeing the West as its enemy and him going through. I made this point that it was 1619 Putin, but this is really just standard communist rhetoric that the Soviet Union was saying throughout the Cold War, is that the West is responsible for all this evil colonialism, slavery, and genocide of the natives. And some people are wanting to defend that. And it's the same with like people who are wanting to defend Iran's BLM rhetoric and standing up for Colin Kaepernick and all of these things. They're like, well, they're just cynically using it to destabilize America. And that's not really the case. It's not destabilizing us for like these tin pot countries to say these things about us. It's a message directed to the non-white world that has grievances against the white world and saying, we're on your side. We believe all your petty grievances against the West, and we're going to lead the effort. And in his argument, he said, Russia will lead the anti-colonial movement throughout the world. And some people on the right are cheering this, like, yeah, especially if they're third worldist mentality who think that we need to ally with every shithole country. By we, I mean, I guess like the internet, right? I guess people on Twitter need to ally with every shithole country, and that somehow if we're allied with Zimbabwe, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, I don't know, all these other countries that easily get bodied by America if in any situation, that the globalist American empire will collapse and will live under based global imperium, which includes North Korea, Zimbabwe, or whatever other African country. I don't think Zimbabwe is totally off the globalist American empire plantation, but Venezuela is, and it's like, wow, this is so awesome. And if you look at any of the rhetoric these guys pursue outside of America, it's all anti-colonialist, anti-white, anti-Western, communist stuff. I mean, even with Iran was a mixture between the Islamic fundamentalists of the country and the like communists of the country. Even though the Islamic fundamentalists won out, a lot of their economic policies still, and a lot of their policies are still influenced by certain segments of socialism. It is a country that is not particularly right wing. When it comes to these things, I mean, people will say, well, they're anti-degeneracy and socially conservative. That's true. But these things are at a very different spectrum in the Middle East, and it's not a country that really likes white people or the West or anything the West has given the world. They're very much anti-Western. And so Russia has now announced it's on its side. And also the war has further cemented the relationship with China to the point that Russia is now a junior partner to China. Like Russia no longer has the leverage and maneuverability with China that it does before, because they're extremely dependent on China. China's one of the few powers in the world that will defend them, along with India, and that people actually take seriously. I mean, people don't take North Korea, Iran, or Venezuela very seriously on the world stage, but they do take China, India seriously on the world stage. I think also along with Saudi Arabia is like still standing with Russia. But outside of that, these are the only places, and these allies really have to suck up to. I mean, Erdogan did show up Putin earlier in one of these meetings where he made Putin wait for Erdogan to show up, and Erdogan just like towered over him, and he really said, like, you need me more than I need you. And so Putin is in a much weaker position, and Russia is in a much weaker position after this war. And going back to, I'm going to go more into this, but the speech itself, I'm tired of these people kind of coping about this. All these people would complain about Trump talking about low black unemployment, and I was like one of those people. It's like, this is annoying. But then when Putin goes into this whole anti-white, anti-Western thing, and people are just like, oh, based? This is just using it for cynical reasons. Don't worry about it. Like, just handle it. It's like, this is what the message he's giving to the world. And he's essentially giving up Europe and the West. And even though he made some remarks about like, oh, there's groups in the West organizing to be more independent. Well, we stand with you. But like, who are those groups are? And it's usually like the groups that they're financing are these like goofball leftists. Like, if you guys remember the clips from this, it was like a communist conference of some sort. I've tried to remember the name. It collapsed because one of its leaders had some hilarious Me Too accusations. But like this whole conference that was organized in America, they had like, they're singing the old Soviet national anthem. They're having all these bizarre flags. Everyone there looks like a goober. And it's like, this is not a serious move. This is not going to overthrow the American government. This is not going to challenge the American government. This is not even going to be a segment of the population represented in America. It's just like a goofball, eccentric crew that doesn't like being part of a mainstream society. And that's what they represent. It's not securing independence at all. And anyway, throughout Europe, and especially even in America, the popular sentiment has turned strongly against Russia. There pretty much no country in the West, maybe with the exception of Hungary and France to a much lesser extent, that has any type of prevailing neutral, we'll even say neutral sentiment towards Russia, much less pro-Russia sentiment. And I mean, yeah. So it's like alienated most of the West. I will even pull up the public figures on this for America. Now, these are recent polls from last month or so that I want to bring up, and you have to remember that these were higher before. There was one poll from August that showed that 53% of Americans support America backing Ukraine until it reclaims all of the territory it claims. Only 18% oppose that decision. A Gallup poll from a few weeks ago shows that 66% of Americans support Ukraine in reclaiming territory, even if it prolongs conflict. Only 31% support ending the conflict quickly, even if it allows Russia to keep territory. And there is one poll that was put out by the Quincy Institute, which is a non-interventionist group founded by, supported by the Kochs, that showed that 48% Americans are growing weary of this, but that is one of the few polls showing that figure. I think there is a significant degree of Americans who are skeptical of the amount of money we're pouring in, especially Republicans. I think these numbers would have been much higher. They were higher in the beginning of the war. I think it was over 80% at the start supported like funding Ukraine and giving them whatever they want. And now it's down to, depending on which the poll you want to believe, 53% to 66%. But it's still overwhelming. It's still a strong majority. Not many people oppose that. Even the poll showing 53%, only 18% oppose it. And if you ask sentiment, I was trying to look around, but I didn't find this one sentiment. If you ask them, like, who do you back in this war? I guarantee you there's not going to be much public sentiment that is pro-Russia. I would maybe even say 1 or 2% at most, and it'd probably be at least 70% for Ukraine, and then like others would just say no comment. Or no, not enough information. They don't want to, unsure. Yeah, and you could even look at, it's probably comparable figures to what the poll in 1940 asked about who Americans supported in World War II, the Axis or the Allies. 84% said the Allies, only 2% said the Axis. I would say it's probably a similar figure now. And so you're not really, and that's just America. I mean, there's still, I think, a stronger element in Europe, but in some countries, it's overwhelming. They want to support this war. I mean, over 70% of Germans who are going to be the most hurt by the war, especially this winter, over 70% still support backing this war to the bitter end. And it's like for the Green Party, which is, depending on the polls, second or third largest party you're looking at, they are it's like 99% of Greens support this. And every party, it's a strong majority. I think it may even be 77% if I'm not. I can't remember. It's over 70%. But every party, it's a strong majority. Even the far left party, Die Linke, which was formed from the ashes of the old East German Communist Party, a majority of them support the war. The only party where it's not a majority of its voters or supporters back continuing the war indefinitely is the AfD, and it's like 30%. 30%, only 30% of them, and they're one of the bigger parties. I think once again, depending on the polls, I think they're fourth or fifth biggest party, but they are. They're ostracized by the state and under state surveillance, and they're the only party that has any agreement. So most people are on the side of Ukraine, even if they have skepticism of how much money we're giving them. There's not a real pro-Russian segment out there outside of right-wing Twitter. I mean, let's be honest, there isn't. Maybe more so in Western Europe, but in America, it is all just on right-wing Twitter. If you go up to even to any like really hardened Trump supporting boomers, they're all going to say like Trump is a thug, like we need to get rid of him. It's a universal opinion. I don't agree with it, but it is what it is. So this goes back to some sobering conclusions I want to emphasize that I think most people know in their hearts, but they don't want to admit. One, Russia is losing the war. I know I can already hear the gasp and like, how dare you say that? But let's look at the situation on the ground. Russia continues to have serious retreats. Not only in Kharkov area, we might need to call it the Kharkiv area because I don't think Russia's going to retake it and Ukraine is going to be emphasizing its Kharkiv. They kicked them out of there a few weeks ago. Now there's a Kherson offensive, which a lot of these pro-Russian bloggers who were more moderate, who were more sober about the the Kharkov offensive, and like, look, this happens. This is a weak sector. Now it's happening in Kherson, which Ukraine has been trying to do an offensive in Kherson for months. And they initially did one, and it was not a success. Even pro-Ukraine people were talking about how a failure it is. But now it's having serious success. They're making serious advances. And pro-Russia people on Telegram are freaking out. There is just mass panic, lots of pessimism there, which you generally do not see that from that segment. That's what one thing you got to realize is, like, you have to ignore about the pro-Ukraine people because they think everything is a victory. But if the pro-Russia people are saying that it's bad, it's bad. There's even one example from a Telegram channel which is talking about, which was tied to some military unit, and they were begging for air support through this Telegram channel. They're like, if you know anyone in the Russian military command, can we get some like air support? We need it right now. And it's like, if Russian units are begging for air support through Telegram, that is not a good sign. And there's other signs of Russian military bloggers who are pro-Russia, by the way, interviewing soldiers, saying that, we're low unit morale. A lot of our morale is collapsing. A lot of Russia's relying a lot on contractors to fight, and these contractors don't want to fight. They easily run away because they're just fighting for money, and they're like, I don't want to lose my life over, a paycheck. And so they just run away. And they're not having the most reliable soldiers. There's also problems with the Ukrainian soldiers. Like, the Ukraine has a lot of the same issues that Russia is. Both of these militaries have a lot of incompetence and corruption in them. And they both have a lot of high-powered weaponry. I think the difference is Ukraine has much better intelligence, especially from the satellites that are giving away Russian positions and Russian advances and what they're maneuvering, and that's really helping out the Ukrainians at the moment. And HIMARS and all these like advanced weaponry system is also helping out Ukraine. Russia has some good weaponry on its side, especially with some of the drones that Iran is sending them and other things, but the intelligence gap is overwhelmingly in favor of Ukraine, and that's always been a major downside for Russia in this war from the beginning, is that the intelligence gap, the overwhelming advantage in terms of intelligence and signet was that Ukraine was giving away these positions and knowing what Russia was going to do, and this really helped out the Ukrainians throughout the war, and it's continuing to help out the Ukrainians. And it's hard for Russia to counter that because all that type of infrastructure is totally on the side of Ukraine, and so they're having those difficulties there. Is that whole area going to collapse? Is Russia going to retreat entirely from Kherson? I don't think so. And if they do, that's really bad for Russia. But I don't think so. I think but they are making serious advances, and it really is hurting morale among those soldiers, as can be seen from these pro-Russia bloggers and others. And it is sending a sign that is also giving a lot of confidence to Ukraine that they can do more offensives. And also Kherson, unlike the Kharkov area, which was guarded mainly by police and contractors, this is a heavily fortified area that they've been fortifying for months, and they had a lot of their elite troops there. The sector that might be having the most serious defects may not have those elite troops, or maybe not be the most fortified, but it's a region that they should be protecting. And they have been preparing for a Ukrainian counteroffensive there for a long time. And at first it seemed like they were succeeding in repelling that offensive, but now they're not. So that's one problem, is that there's continued Ukrainian advances. There's a lot of momentum on Ukraine's side. And with that momentum, it also keeps the West and America wanting to keep giving them money. Because if Ukraine is telling the world, hey, we're winning, look at all these advances we're having in these territories, we really got them on the run, that makes it harder to tell them no, to give them no when they ask for money. Because they're like, we've got the Russians on the run, we're about to accomplish our war aims, we just need more money, we're actually succeeding. This is always the case when someone's asking for money, whether it's like some type of donation you're asking or what have you, or an investment. If you're showing success, that brings more money to you, and it's harder to say no. It's like if you have a successful company and you're like, we would like more investment, and you can get a bigger return on this investment, people are not going to be like, oh, no, we're cutting you off completely despite your successes. That's just not going to happen. And it really does make it harder for Europe to tell, no, we're cutting off the spigot to you guys. You got to make a peace deal. If they're having successes, it makes Ukraine less likely to want a peace deal because they think they can take back all that territory. And only significant defeats can change their mindset on that. So that's one. So those are two big things: is that it's hurting the Russian troop morale. They're making serious advances, and it's encouraging Ukraine to not want to make a peace deal and encouraging more support for Ukraine from the West. Second is the mobilization effort. The mobilization effort was supposed to be this intimidating maneuver that was going to frighten Ukraine and show that the entire Russian nation was behind the Russian war effort. And polling does show that the majority of Russians support the war effort. But it appears a lot of Russians do not want to actually fight in the war because, and this is a big difference between Ukraine and Russia, all these Russians are fleeing to the border. They're fleeing to Georgia. There all these border, posts and roads going to another country are packed with cars, people trying to flee. And there's all these fighting age males who are trying to get out of the country. There's been videos coming in from like Russian police having to fight guys on airplanes who are trying to flee through flights. This is not good optics for Russia, and even a lot of the local, or not local media, but national media in Russia is complaining about the conscription. They're saying that, like, I have a friend who's like 50 years old who should not be fighting. He's got like a bad back. He, of course, should not be fighting at all. And he's being conscripted. And I know young men who are not being conscripted at all. They're complaining that these conscripts are not getting food or supplies or weaponry that they need. It is, maybe Western media is over-exaggerating this case, but you can't over-exaggerate these guys fleeing the country. And Ukraine was certainly having the same difficulties with the guys being conscripted or even just signing up. These guys would sign up. There's a ton of examples of this, of Western people coming to Ukraine and them saying, I want to sign up. And then they're just sent out in the field with no training, no weapons, no food. And they're like, this sucks. So Ukraine and Russia are the same page with that. The difference is there was not this huge exodus of fighting age men. There was an exodus of a lot of Ukrainians. Now, mostly women and children are these migrants that clearly didn't want to fight for the country they're living in. And there were a number of fighting age male who are trying to get out of the country. But those fighting age men were targets of derision and contempt by the Ukrainian people. There was not the long line of cars of fighting age men trying to get out. Most of these men were eagerly signing up. The Ukraine has not had any trouble finding recruits among its own population. Which is different from how people thought the war would go in the initial stages, that if Ukraine was fighting this war, or if Russia invaded, the military would collapse, the people would say, we don't want to fight. I said this too. I was wrong. A lot of people were wrong. And they're going to say, we don't want to fight. We don't really care what government we have. It's going to be corrupt no matter what, whatever, we'll have that. But that's not the case. All these people, whether they've been psyoped by propaganda or not, they feel that they are fighting for their homeland. They feel that they are fighting for their country, and they're willing to give their lives for it and sign up and fight for it. Now, they still have the same problems as these Russian conscripts of, not being fed, not getting the proper weaponry, not getting the training. But the difference is Russia is supposed to be this powerful military, one of the most powerful militaries in the world. They're supposed to have their shit together. Ukraine, no one thought that Ukraine had their shit together. Russia's supposed to have their shit together, and they've been planning a mobilization and for a long time and talking about the possibility. And the fact that it's just turned into a clown show where Ukraine is not intimidated by it at all, that they're just showing that a lot of these conscripts are unwilling to fight, they're poorly trained, poorly fed, poorly equipped. They're not that intimidated at all. But the one thing is about the mobilization is that the mobilization will probably solidify the frontiers and help Russia make advances into reclaiming some of the territory they lost before, especially probably in Kherson. You can probably see once these conscripts are mobilized and fully, or whatever type of training they get, they'll probably be a lot sent to Kherson, and you will see that front line stabilize and probably the Ukrainians push back through there. I think what the war efforts now mission is just reclaiming all of that territory that they have said that they've annexed. So the complete regions of those 4 territories that they annex, and that's going to be the new goal. They're probably not. I don't think they're going to go after Kharkov. Primarily because they don't want to engage in another long urban siege, especially if it's going to take a lot of casualties. Is one thing is Putin has tried to avoid casualties on his side and civilian casualties on the other. I know this is sounds like a Russian propaganda, but they, compared to how other people have fought wars, they have tried their best. It hasn't always worked, obviously, because it is war and there's a lot of incompetence and stupidity on the Russian side, but they have tried to do it, and they've been very squeamish about these urban sieges. And with Kharkov, second largest city, huge Ukrainian national segment there, and the fact that Ukraine knows that they have a blank check from the West and that they can fight to the last man there, and they have enough people who are willing to fight to the death there. It's going to be very costly for Russia, and Russia does not want to incur more deaths than they need to keep this war popular. And also, the mobilization is not being greeted with much with enthusiasm among the Russian people. It is really pissing people off. People are, I was fine with the war as long as it didn't affect me. Now it's affecting me, and I'm pissed. I don't want to, I have a job, I have a family I need to take care of. Instead, they're going to go send me to fight and die in the Donbass. This is a common sentiment there, as you can see by the people trying to flee. And so this does undermine a lot of how Russia presents itself to the world, especially the right, is that it's like a totally unified, homogenous state where the majority of citizens are willing to fight and die for the country. And now we see this, and it's not actually the case. I mean, they still have a lot of Russians who are willing to fight and die, but apparently they don't want to fight and die in Ukraine or give up their job or whatever they're doing to go and do so. It's a different situation in Ukraine. I mean, the difference is that Ukraine, they're fighting on their own territory, and for countries throughout world history, that has generally been a greater motivator for people to come out and fight and defend and die than it is for an aggressor. It's harder, different levels of motivation there. When you feel that you're defending your home, you're more motivated to fight. When you feel that you're being sent to a war that's far away from your home, you're not defending your home, different scenario. The Soviet Union it was very easy for the Soviet Union to find people willing to fight and die for the Soviet Union, for Russia, or for their homes during World War II, because they were under attack, they were under invasion, and they were saying you have to fight for your homes and your families, and you have to sign up, and sure enough they did. And it's the same going on in Ukraine. But it's harder for aggressors. I mean, imagine if Iraq was going terribly and we decided to do mass conscription here. That would have not gone over well. Even the enthusiasm in Russia seems to be waning. I mean, people did, they looked at the camera of people in the audience for Putin's speech, and there was at least 1 or 2 people sleeping during it. It's not a good sign. There's a lot of bad optics coming from Russia, and even the tone of that speech was not coming from a position of strength. It was coming from a position of weakness, of an animal backed into a corner and lashing out. Not the stance that Russia was taking at the beginning of this war. Very different stance now. I think Russia does not have as much of an upper hand as it did before. And even in any peace negotiations, I think it would have a weak hand, because Ukraine seems willing to fight to the end, because not only, for one, its elite is making a hell of a lot of money. They are all multimillionaires now from the funding. Of course, it's a corrupt country, and all that money come in. All these leaders are taking their cuts, and they're making so much money. And so why do they want to cut off their wealth? They don't want to cut off that wealth. They're making a ton of money, so they want that money to come in. There's also plenty of Ukrainians who are willing to fight and die for their country, and that has not been exhausted yet. And America is willing to keep giving them the tons and tons of money. Now, that may change with a Republican Congress. I don't know how much it will be cut off, but there could be a push from that. Most Republicans are, at least half of Republicans, I wouldn't say most, half of Republicans are fine with giving more and more money. But if there's a strong public backlash, eventually, against the amount of money we're giving, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to hide it. They knew the $40 billion we gave them back in I think May. was really unpopular. So what they're doing is instead they're doing smaller bills. It's like, oh, here's 800 million, here's a billion once a week, and they just give it in smaller amounts, so it doesn't seem as much, but it's amounting to a lot. It's getting close to 100 billion, if I'm not mistaken. And that adds up. And if there's a public push and Republicans feel that this would be a good campaign issue in 2024, then yeah. But the only way they're going to do that is if it seems like Ukraine is unnecessarily throwing lives away and they're never going to gain that territory. At this moment, it doesn't seem like that. So the money spigot is going to keep flowing for the time being. It might change when winter comes and Russia has a successful counteroffensive, takes back a lot of the territory that they lost, and Europe is freezing, and there's like riots or whatever. There's a lot of social disturbance going on in Europe. That all may change. But once again, America blew up some of the resources to the energy. Now it has to go through Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe may be like, we're not going to allow this to come through our countries. So who knows? There's a lot of things in play here, but it is like a very grim assessment from that. And it's like also Nordstream, is that America has been getting away with a lot of provocations, from the sinking of that battleship, from target assassination of Russian generals, and now to the likely explosion of Nordstream. They're really doing a lot of provocations and aggressive acts against Russia, and Russia just has to take it because they're the weaker country here. It's similar to what America did in Iran, or against Iran, with the assassination of General Soleimani back in 2020. Even at that time, and especially I was like, this is terrible. This may lead to war. This could lead to terrorism. And it's like, Soleimani fought against ISIS. Like, why would we do this? And, a lot of non-interventionists were getting into that mode. But at the end, what did Iran do? They did nothing. They got spanked, and they got humiliated, and they just took it. All these countries, America's learning that a lot of these countries who make a big fuss about America and maybe look like threats to America, they will eat shit if we force them to eat shit, as it's seen with the assassination of Soleimani, as being seen a lot of the things we're doing in the Ukraine war. And there has to be a minimum, there is a red line we won't cross. I don't think America does not want to escalate this into a war between NATO, a full formal war between NATO and Russia. They also don't want to escalate this to a nuclear struggle. They are having some difficulty not doing that because they're backing Putin into a corner, but they feel confident that Putin will not do that, and that they can, keep their involvement to not going over this red line and ensuring that it doesn't escalate into nuclear war or something terrible like that. But they do feel that they can keep pushing the line and do some infractions of the line over it, such as what they see with Nordstream. I keep calling Nordstream the Nordstream gas line. That would be a lot of great fashion coming through there. Nord Stream pipeline, that's going over there. They have that sinking the battleship, target assassination. They're able to get away with this stuff. And Russia is incapable of responding because Russia also doesn't want to escalate this past what it can, what it wants to. Even with their mobilization, it's showing that Russia really cannot escalate this even further, is that they're having, major difficulties with their partial mobilization. This is not even a full mobilization. It's a partial mobilization. So they're not going to do a full mobilization because it's with the problems that they're having with the partial mobilization. So all these factors are coming in, and you have to look at what Russia was trying to do at the beginning of the war. They were trying to decapitate the regime. They were trying to, one of the advances was to Kiev. They wanted to knock out Kiev, replace the regime with a friendlier one, and they wanted to bring back Ukraine into Russia's orbit. That failed. And we should have all realized that when they retreated from Kiev, or there was a stalemate around Kiev. They were not going to encircle the city, and they pulled out. Now, it looked like they were having successes before, and it looked like the Ukraine military could not wage a successful counteroffensive, and they really could do nothing but get shelled by the Russians in this artillery duel, and Russians were grinding and pounding them down, where that Russia could just take these advances at a leisurely pace, not have to worry about many casualties their side while inflicting mass casualties on Ukrainian side. And that seemed to be working in the summer because they made serious advances in Lugansk and and Donetsk, and even into the Kharkov area, and in Kherson, they made serious advances, and they're inflicting a lot of casualties on these Ukrainians. But I think one thing we failed, or that may have been the case, I'm not sure this is 100% true. I've talked about this with some people who are experts on this, who have been paying close attention to this, is that a lot of those troops who were dying were parts of the nationalist militia. And Zelensky was effectively using them as cannon fodder for his agenda. And he didn't really like the nationalist militias because they didn't answer to him. They're wild cards, and they also threatened his regime because, and they constricted his hand of what he could do because he had to ensure that he pleased the nationalist militias, so they didn't try to overthrow him. Well, he solved this by letting Russians kill them. Now, I had this take, I shared this in a few different podcasts, is that what I thought Zelensky was doing is that he was trying to get the nationalist militias wiped out so he then could make a peace deal with Russia. I was mistaken on the second part. The first part, I was correct on it. And you can see this in the counteroffensives because most of the counteroffensives are being conducted by regular Ukrainian military, not the nationalist militias. The nationalist militias have been taken much of the brunt of the casualties for most of the war, and they are much weaker now than they were at the beginning of the war. And they're not being, and it seems that they're not being used in these offensives. It's the regular military. So he did accomplish one objective, but instead the second objective is that he's going to use troops that are completely loyal to the regime and answer to him against the Russians. And that's what he's doing now. And it's undermining the militias while the militias keep getting shelled by the Russians, whatever remnants of them are still there. And so this has actually been, it did give Zelensky a freer hand, but it gave him his freer hand to continue the war in the way he wants it without having to worry about militias that want to do their own strategy and are not going to follow orders. He instead has the military that is following his orders and is not going to try to counter his objectives and do their own thing. He doesn't have to worry about these independent thorn in his ass. So Zelensky's authority has been strengthened. Also, he's been arresting all these pro-Russia people and either kicking them out of the country, or some of them have been even executed. So he doesn't have to worry about the pro-Russian segment anymore. And most of those people have been discredited in the eyes of people who are outside the annexed territories. It's really only in the annexed territories where these people have any degree of popularity. And some of them are getting assassinated as well. So they have to worry about that. I think it was Kherson's mayor, or one of those types of people who was recently assassinated. And so there's outside of the annexed territory, there is no pro-Russian opposition whatsoever anymore in the country. They have been thoroughly discredited in the eyes of the public. Nobody wants to associate with them, and many of them have been arrested to popular acclaim, or they've had to flee to Russian areas. So there's none of that. And even the nationalist opposition, which is fully in line with Zelensky's military objectives, has been killed. I mean, many of them are just dead. Like, they've been literally killed by Russia. And they don't present as much of a threat to Zelensky's order anymore as before. And also, Zelensky's government and the military are the ones getting the money directly and weaponry directly from America, and I think these militias are having to wait to be being doled out to them, which gives the government greater authority over them. So I don't think Zelensky's regime is going to collapse anytime. I think, the real wild thing is that I don't think either regime is going to collapse, but the one that probably has a greater chance at this point, once again, a lot of these things can change. This is not definite. But the regime that probably has a greater chance at this point of collapsing is Putin. Because if Putin does not keep these annexed territories, like the fact that he's announced these annexation is like, this is Russian territory, is that he has to defend that ground with all his life, with all of his resources. Because if they give up any of that territory, they're saying we have lost to Ukraine. So those borders, any inch of that territory that is given over to Ukraine is going to be seen as a defeat. So the type of victory is just them saying we have this territory and we're keeping it. And Ukraine recognizes that. And that's the only line of victory they can have. So what will victory look like for Ukraine? Will they demilitarize the country? No. That was one of their objectives going into the war. Not going to demilitarize it whatsoever. Are they going to affect regime change? No. Unless the only type of regime change that could happen is maybe if Zelensky tries to make a peace deal and some of these nationalist militias that are still living overthrow him. But I think even their hand is much weaker now to do that. So they're not going to, and there's no pro-Russia opposition anymore in the country, or at least in that part. All the pro-Russian opposition is now within the annexed territories, if they're still living and have not been arrested or executed. That's where they are. And are they going to keep Ukraine out of NATO? Maybe, but I think that their ability to keep Ukraine out of NATO is not in their hands. It's more in the hands of America of how much they want to antagonize Russia. And what may occur is that they are not demilitarized. They have a firmly anti-Russia regime there. And they just simply say, we won't join NATO, but we can have the military support that we've been getting before is still going to be occurring. We're still going to be building up our military, and we're still going to be getting Western investment. And also we might join the EU. They may just not join NATO, but by all intents and purposes, they will be a informal NATO member. They just won't be subject to the treaty, but that won't be up to Russia. Russia's not going to have the strong hand for throughout the world unless something dramatically changes. And with Russia, the one thing is that this war is going to go on for a very long time. This war, probably by this time next year, is still going to be going on. Probably going into the next presidential election and after that. I think we're going to be seeing this war go on for at least 2 years. Now, if they somehow make a peace deal after the winter, the earliest it could end is sometime after the winter, and Europe has a complete catastrophe with their winter thing, and they're like, we want this war to end, and maybe Ukraine suffers some serious reversals that maybe not only do they get kicked out of the territory claimed by Russia, but some of the other territory that Russia does not claim, they get pushed back from, and maybe America just maybe there's a huge push in Congress to limit the amount of funding for Ukraine, and Ukraine comes to a peace deal, and that's it. But the real only peace deal that's going to happen is they're not going to agree to demilitarization. They're not going to agree to be closer to Russia for the rest of Ukraine. All they would really agree to is the territory that has been annexed by Russia. Now, that may seem like a victory for Russia. Maybe it could be. It shows something. But it is far below the goals of what Russia wanted. Russia, rather than annexing that territory, wanted to bring back Ukraine into Russia's sphere. They failed to do that. That's always been their goal. Ever since Maidan, is to keeping Ukraine within Russia's orbit. It's been the drive of their foreign policy and how they've tried to control Ukraine for many years. They've never wanted Ukraine to join the West. And what this war has done is that is officially made Ukraine a member of the West, whether Russia likes it or not. Now, it may take some of those territories with it. I don't think it'll take any more territories, as they really wanted to go further into getting Kharkov and Odessa and some of these other regions that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. Primarily Kharkov and going into Odessa, they're not going to go into those territories. It's like the amount of cost it would have for them. I don't think it is there. It's going to be very costly to keep the territories that they've annexed, and that is really what Putin has to do to survive. If Putin is pushed out of any of those territories, his regime will collapse. It is such a massive failure for him. If they get kicked out of Ukraine entirely, it is over for Putin. It's probably over for Russia being a serious world power. They're already not a very serious world power, but it's they're going to be a satrap of America or China or whoever if Putin falls and they're kicked out of Ukraine. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they'll retain control of the territories, and there will be reverses for Ukraine in the winter. But the most that's going to happen is that Ukraine says that this is the territory, this is Russian territory, we recognize that, and that's it. Now, when are they going to make that deal? Earliest possible is February. I don't know. It depends on how bad the winter. Maybe March, but I'm skeptical it'll be that long because America is fully committed to this. America just feels like it can humiliate Europe with abandon and doesn't have to listen to them. And so I don't feel that they're going to feel a need to. And America is going to continue this war. There are things that could change. But if there's a new Congress in and they still keep funding the Ukraine effort and Europe, suffers under a winter and then they come out of it and not much has changed, then the war is going to last for at least another year or two. And both Russia and Ukraine are going to have to suffer a lot of losses during this pointless war that could have been easily solved with a peace deal, but only really Russia and Europe want a peace deal now. I mean, Russia really does. I mean, I think even Putin realizes that this war has been much costlier than they thought. But Ukraine's leadership and America have no interest in ending the war anytime soon because it serves their interest that Ukraine wants to take back that territory and is driven by hatred towards Russia. And America wants to effect regime change in Russia, and they feel that if the war continues to go poorly for Russia, that objective will be achieved. So, and Ukraine and America have greater sway over whether this conflict continues or not, more so than any other party. So some people may be accusing me of blackpilling them and blah, blah, blah. I'm always accused of this, but for one, reality is reality. You just have to accept it and move on from there and go along. It should not be a call for defeatism and like, oh, it's all over. I can't believe Russia didn't save us. I think from the war's beginning, we were mistaken in this belief that Russia could deal a humiliating blow to the globalist American empire. When I was initially talking about this war, and I've always said that I was neutral. I want to make this point. It's like I emphasize I was neutral in my past shows, but I was interested in the fact that if Russia got a victory, that it would deal a blow to the gay, would make Europe reconsider its dependence on the gay, and it would make America reconsider its foreign entanglements and a lot of its policies throughout the world. Those things have not happened. All the good things I thought that may have happened as a result of this war and changes that could have happened, the opposite has occurred. Europe is even more dependent on America than before the war, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And America is even more firmly committed to its interventionism and reckless policy. And I think one really negative side effect of this is, however, if this war continues to go poorly for Russia, that America will be more eager to do foreign interventions in the future. It will want to do a regime change against Iran. It will want to do aggressive actions against China. If there are European states that are not on the plantation, say Hungary or others, it will try to force them out. This will be a result of this disastrous war that Russia decided to go into. And I would say this, like Russia had a stronger position before the conflict than after. Before the conflict, they were building Nordstream 2. Nordstream 2 was about to be completed. They were about to have even greater sway over Europe. They were able to intimidate Ukraine and tell them to not mass troops around the areas that are claimed by the separatist forces. They had just defended Belarus from a color revolution. They were in a strong position. Now they're in a very weak position, where also one thing is Belarus is going to be a weakened country, is going to be in a very precarious state after this. They're going to try to do a color revolution again, and it'll likely be more successful. And Putin will have to invade Belarus to save its last remaining ally in Europe. And that will not be good for Putin at all, or Russia at all. Once again, that invasion may not succeed. They may still be bogged down in Ukraine when this is happening, and they may not have the forces for it. And it's just going to create a much messier situation for Russia and make it more difficult for that regime to survive. And they're definitely going to go for this too. That's one thing, is that they're going to try to do another color revolution in Belarus after this conflict, due to the way this conflict is resulting in. So that's bad about this. But I think one thing that we should take as not a white pill, not a black pill, but a clear pill, is that we are not Russians. Our fate is not tied with Russia. We should have never been seeing, people should have never been seeing Russia or Putin as a great savior. It's a very incompetent state with serious problems that is not capable of waging war like America. Like, everyone complains about America's war efforts, but militarily, we did really good in Afghanistan and Iraq. And people are going to argue like, but we lost. When we were in combat against these enemies, we wiped them out. The problem is the political struggle is that we couldn't force the locals to turn into Westerners or turn into Americans or want what type form of government we wanted. There was not a problem on the battlefield. If our troops were put up against the Taliban, Iraqi army, or ISIS, or these Shia militias, whatever, who was ever coming our way, not a real contest. Okay, there was not a contest at all in this conflict. Similar to Vietnam, if people listen to my IQ supplement, like in Vietnam, we were wiping the floor with the Vietnamese. I mean, we in conflict, and even then we were taking much higher casualties than they were in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when we were in combat with the North Vietnamese, especially open conflict, like traditional battle, not like ambushes, not a contest. So our military was showing up as a very strong force compared to this stuff of like the normal Russian military having serious withdrawals and on the run from another military force. That has not happened to America probably since, well, we did have a few of those events in Vietnam, but we quickly reversed them in a lot of those cases. I mean, there's of course a few examples that you could say, well, that's not so much the case, but last 50 years, there's not a case of that. Like, it's just been us steamrolling over people. It's just been the political struggle that's been problem, and like the unnecessary treasure we wasted on these governments. But even with Iraq, like take Iraq for example, Afghanistan, you could say like the initial objective of it was to wipe out Al Qaeda. Mostly mission. I don't know if you'd say fully achieved, but we did make them not capable of openly hiding out in Afghanistan, is that they had to flee to Pakistan, or some of them were still living in Afghanistan under Taliban protection, as happened with the last Al-Qaeda leader we just killed. But so Afghanistan's a little bit tougher. I mean, the clear failure is that us trying to set up any type of government was bound to fail, and we should have just, once we wiped out Al-Qaeda, we should have made a deal with Taliban saying, look, you can take back this government because clearly we're not going to set up one on our own. We just insist that you do not give safe harbor to international terrorists, and we leave. And we probably would have gotten a deal. And it appears that we may have even made that deal with the Taliban when we left, because sure enough, shortly after we leave, we kill the leader of Al-Qaeda, which may have been given over to us by Taliban in exchange for something. So that's something to consider. With Iraq, there was a lot of casualties. It is a lot of failures and mistakes made on. And also, this war was completely stupid. There was no reason for us to be there. But from what America's objectives were, is that we take out Saddam and we put in a friendly government there, and that friendly government survives. And we left there well over 10 years ago, and that government's still in place. Even though it got threatened by ISIS, it was able to beat back ISIS. That government is wildly corrupt, open Iranian influence. It has a lot of problems, but it is a weak country. It is not a rogue actor like Saddam is. We don't have to worry about Iraq anymore. The only thing we have to worry about Iraq is Iranians' influence now, and maybe a possibility of Islamic extremism, but from the perspective of the people who were planning the war, they felt that was a much more worthy of a cost to take than it was to have Saddam around. And some of these things, other interventions like Libya, was a disaster for Europe, but it was not we didn't really, besides Benghazi, we didn't really incur many of the aftermath of Libya. We took out another rogue actor that we wanted to say. Now that's like a failed state, but To America, that's not really our problem. It's Europe's problem. Once again, us like doing something stupid and Europe paying the cost. It's the same with Syria, with us escalating and supporting moderate rebels there, and that caused the migrant crisis in 2015. And Europe got flooded with that. Once again, not something that we have to pay for. I don't agree that these things are good. I'm just saying that this is like coming from a foreign policy. And what has happened in Ukraine has restored American strength in the world. Once again, I'm not using this in like positive quality. I'm just saying like strength and just simple strength in how the world sees it from the Afghanistan debacle. I think a big reason why Russia went in was seeing the Afghanistan debacle and seeing America is not going to help out Ukraine. It is trying to retreat from the world, and they were mistaken in that assumption. And now we've been restored to the strength because like just what we've been able to do to Europe and in this conflict and the provocations we've done, unanswered provocations we've done to Russia, it really does restore that preeminence and dominance in the world stage with America. And I think this war, the way it's gone, has probably made China very hesitant to go over into Taiwan as a result of that. So it's hard to see. I would say this. It's like been a total victory for Global's American Empire. But without that regard, I think there needs to us reconsider how we view geopolitics and how we view us being saved or the situation being improved. Our situation is not going to be improved by foreign actors or directly by foreign actors acting in our aid. Or it is our savior is not going to be some stupid foreign country, whether it's Iran or I don't know why even people like Iran, but I've said this before, but like any of these other tin pot countries that are around the world, it's not going to come from them. It's going to come from us. We have to work within the system we have. We're not going to expect this regime to collapse anytime soon. We have to work within its confines and seek to reform it and make it better and to reduce its negative effect on the world and reduce its negative effect on our people and our own country. And that's how we have to see. And we have to be politically pragmatic and not trying to alienate ourselves from the rest of the population. Because by being pro-Russia or like really emphatically pro-Russia, to the point where I think like the Tucker Carlson line is correct, where you're really critical of like the war cheerleaders and those who are just like believe every lie that Ukraine pushes out. Like the Tucker line is the correct thing, but you shouldn't go past it. Like seeing Russia as the good guys or as our savior, or they really need our tweets and support. That's just silly. People need to reconsider that and move on and focus on ourselves, because only we are going to save ourselves. It's not going to be some outside actor acting in our good interest, because Russia doesn't care about us. Russia doesn't care about Europe. They now see us and Europe as the enemy. I mean, for legitimate reasons, of course. I'm not saying that it's illegitimate reasons, but that's this case. And it's this case with a lot of these other anti-American states throughout the world. These people are not going to help us. They want to harm us just as much as the globalist American empire, and they don't view any distinction between us and the regime that rules over us. So it's really just working within the confines of the system, trying to make improvements to it, trying to wake people up and educate people, but not going to taking positions that are so wildly alienating from the rest of the population. We do take some of our core positions are like that, like the stuff we say about race and identity in American history. That's not shared by the mainstream of the population, but that's the truth, and those are our core positions. But when those are our core positions, we shouldn't adopt everything that is outside the mainstream and alienated to the population, because in order to overcome that reluctance to hear what we have to say, you have to meet people where they are on other matters. And when it comes to just like wanting to be pro-Russian supporters, it also adds you to like the federal government's watch list and the FBI targeting. Is like they are very serious. If you're like death to America, overthrow the government, and like I stand Putin, it's like they're gonna somebody at the FBI is gonna take notice of that, and you're not gaining anything to do this. It's just like it's a very like punk attitude, and by punk I'm not saying in the positive sense, because everyone likes to use like, oh, this is so punk, that's like positive. I mean, it's like punk and like you're just trying to do transgression and rebellion for status signaling among either your subculture or just to be different from the rest of the population. And unlike being a punk where you're like getting some crazy hairstyle or some crazy piercing, and people just roll their eyes or whatever, when you're doing this stuff on a political level and saying these crazy stuff and extreme stuff, that could lead to both like loss of employment and even persecution from the state. So you need to avoid that because for obvious reasons. I don't even feel like I need to explain this. So those are just my thoughts on that. I think all this is not meant to be a black pill. It's meant to be a clear pill about our situation and what we need to do and to readjust to the stances. We're not going to be saved by some outside actor who's like really anti-America. I mean, China hates us. And like even with like looking at China, all these states are no different from China now after this war. There's not any, like even with Russia being more nationalistic and saying more things criticizing anti-white racism in America and those type of things. Yeah, that's nice that they're doing that, but ultimately their goal is the same as China's now. And it is what it is. I'm not like advocating for you to be anti-Russia. I'm especially not advocating for you to be pro-Ukraine because I don't like how they're strong-arming our government into giving them blank checks and them all getting wealthy off of the American taxpayer and waging this stupid war that's hurting their own country and hurting Europe and not in our American interests and possibly leading to nuclear war. So I'm all opposed to that. But the main issue is like pro-Russia is just like defeating. I mean, they're not effectively challenging the globalist American empire. They are barely holding on to what is theirs, and they really don't care about our situation anymore. And it's a major political liability to become Putin cheerleaders. So that's the conclusion. I know this would be very controversial for a lot of people, probably going to get a lot of hate, but I just call it like it, see it. I'm not here to grift off people. People always accuse me of that. But if I was grifting off people, I would tell people what they want to hear constantly and just say, oh, Putin is winning or whatever a lot of people want to hear. I never do that. I always try to follow the truth wherever it lies and where it leads to. And I try to address the situation as it is, not how I wish it would be. And I want always, an important part I always have in my podcast is that we need to face reality and face our situation as it is, not how it wishes to be, to have any chance of success. So that's my thoughts on that. That's a very long topic. So we're going to have to move on to the cognitive elite questions, which will be much more of a clear white pill for people over time. Even though I think that this, the past episode is not, you really should not be doomed out by it or pessimistic. You should just have a sense of clarity about looking at this issue and judging it fairly and objectively. So I will move on to the cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And if you haven't already, make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements because there's topics I did not get to cover today that I'm going to have to cover in this week's IQ supplement. So make sure to sign up for that if you haven't already. This question comes from Luke. He asks, Scott, what are your thoughts now on the upcoming midterms? Any new predictions or updates? And we're finally going to have a white pilled segment for Highly Respected because I want to say I am now more confident that Republicans are going to win the midterms. I know I've had some, being with the news cycle and being really paying close attention to the news cycle, like some people have been saying, oh, well, the polling shows this and that. Republicans are really gaining an advantage. And also I have to point out, I talked about the last segment a lot with the news cycle with Russia and Ukraine. I was talking with somebody and they were saying that I was too obsessed with the news cycle, that this is just based on last week's news cycle and, just following along with the news, which is a problem with political analysis, is that things change from week to week and you really have to look from a broad picture. And that's especially true with elections and other matters. But the Russia thing, it's really looking at it from a broad perspective. And if you look at how the war began and other things like them retreating from Kiev and just making small gains and then like the massive amount of money getting pumped into Ukraine, and you look at all the factors that are happening in the country, it really leads to my new position, not to the week-to-week basis. Even though last week was very bad for Russia, it really was just a clarifying moment that, if you take a step back and look at the broad picture of the conflict, you do not see a rosy picture for Russia at all. And I've also really wanted to emphasize this point that we need to stop seeing ourselves represented by these foreign states that are not really aligned with us at all. That's my point. But going back to the elections, yes, and going from week to week news cycle, you can't really tell, and it's always like different changes in polls. I've always said that I still think Republicans are going to win the majority, but it may be smaller than it should have been. I am sticking to that point, but that's still what Republicans want. A win is a win. If they still just have a slight majority in the House and they only have a 1-seat majority in Senate, that's still a majority. That still gives them control of committees. That still gives them the power to stop any legislation that comes through and even stop nominees from judiciary or to the cabinet. It really gives them a lot of power with that majority. It's better if they have a little bit more majority, and they should have a bigger majority with the economic situation and just the open border crisis and all these terrible things that Biden has done. They really should be being more successful in the midterms, but other factors have just come into play. As I said, before, abortion hasn't been, it is making suburbanites lean more back to Democrats and motivating a lot of young women to come out and register to vote for Democrats. How much of a factor it may prove remains to be seen, but I do think it's going to be a factor. I don't think it's going to cost Republicans the majority. Republicans are still going to retake Congress besides the issue. And so people will, after all, say, like, well, it was worth it. The minor losses we accrued from achieving what we've been wanting to do for 50 years was worth it. A lot of Republicans will argue that position. But Republicans have an issue to counteract abortion, and that is crime. Crime is becoming a huge winner for Republicans. Polling showed Ron Johnson was down to his opponent, Mandela Barnes, I think is his name. Who's this radical black liberal guy, always been a fan of defunding police, abolishing ICE. Ron Johnson has taken hold of the crime issue and is now ahead in the polling. Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania is now getting in the polls due to the crime issue. That's also doing very well in other places. It is a major winner, even though Democrats and liberal media outlets like this is racist to point out the crime problem. It is a major winner for Republicans, and people in cities and states where there's a huge crime problem like Pennsylvania. Philadelphia has an insane murder rate. Milwaukee and Wisconsin has an insane murder rate. Crime spilling out into Atlanta, and Georgia's a battleground state this year. Crime is really a winning issue that'll probably counteract any type of gains Democrats might make. It'll bring back suburbanites, and it's clearly helping Republicans in polls. Also, immigration is going to help Republicans polls. The one place where abortion may doom very good candidates is in Arizona. Carrie Lake and Blake Masters are in competitive races. They're both very America First. They're both people that we should be very excited that are there and are, the nominees for the party. But the state, maybe not the right time, decided to institute a very severe anti-abortion law that imposes like severe penalties on people who participate in it. It's not, you can argue that that's the type of law you want, but right before an election may not be the right time to institute it. That could hurt both of them in the Arizona election. It could not. If they both succeed and they both win, then it does negate how important abortion was an issue, at least in the state of Arizona. Because if they win, even with that law on the books, then, whatever disadvantage it caused the Republicans wasn't significant enough to cause these two candidates to lose in a battleground state. So that's what they could argue with. So I think there's a lot of things to be very optimistic about. when it comes to elections. I'm more confident now. I think the polling's going to continue to increase in Republican favor. There was like a brief boost in the summer, primarily due to, I guess, the abortion ruling, maybe some, Biden passing some legislation, I guess. I don't really know, but I think there's more of a sense that the country, and the world are in a bad shape and it's time for something different, and Republicans are there. And some people may argue, like, how is this a white pill? Republicans are going to sell us out. Oh, we shouldn't be pro-Republican, whatever. One thing I want to emphasize, there's a lot of points that can be emphasized there. But one point I want to emphasize right now is that would be a positive advantage of Republicans is their ability to rein in this persecution of middle Americans. Their ability to rein in all these prosecutions being associated with January 6th. I don't think a Congress is going to have the ability to rein in an investigation of Trump, but there's a possibility. And there's also the definite possibility that they'll end these FBI arrests of people like the pro-life activists in Pennsylvania or these J6 people, and even what J6 committee wants to do. The Republicans will be able to say, we're not going to do this anymore. And also they can also push Democrats to maybe investigate the riot, or they can do their own committees, maybe on Antifa or BLM riots. That could be something that they could do. I don't think it's the most likely thing, but it's something they could do just as a way of skewering Democrats there. And just getting the deep state off the backs of Trump supporters would be a win of itself. Democrats and Republicans, there's not going to be a lot of legislation passed through. I mean, Democrats have a majority in the House and a very bare majority in the Senate, and they've pretty much gotten hardly anything passed. Now, if Republicans are there, they're not going to pass anything, and that's a win. And whatever legislation they would want to pass is most likely to be terrible. Also, an election, even though Republicans aren't going to save the world after the midterms, and they're probably not going to do a lot of major changes, the fact that the American people would say, or would go to the polls and just vote for the opposition party to the party that represents wokeness and all the crazy shit that we oppose, is a good sign. It shows that people see the world around them and they're not willing to accept it and they want to change it. And yes, voting isn't going to solve all our problems. Yes, this one election isn't going to, the whole world's not going to be instantly restored, and a Republican Congress would do everything we want. But it at least sends that message that there are millions of people out there who recognize that there's something wrong in this country and they want it changed, and that they will, at least at the bare minimum, vote for the party that is far less worse than the Democrats. And that's a hopeful sign. And it's something to be to look forward to. And I'm not one of those people who think that like every election from here on out is going to be rigged. I still think that there's a chance Republicans can win in 2024, the White House and Congress. And as I said, I'm very optimistic that Republicans are going to win in these midterms. Of course, they should be winning by a larger margin, but I think the abortion really did affect that. But I think it'll still, and some other factors as well. Maybe lower enthusiasm for Republicans are among their base. There's some other factors that are going into there. But overall, I still think they're going to win. It's got to keep campaigning, got to keep hitting Democrats on crime, this immigration issue, and these persecutions, and the horrible economy, and even the tax issue probably will help them out. So I think this is a good thing. And also, if Republicans can repeal that 87,000 IRS agents, even though that's not really dealing with our issues, I think most Americans would be happy with that and with fewer auditings and everything. So those are things to keep in mind. So I want to end that. I know that's not a huge, massive white pill, but it's something to see as a positive sign in our country that people are still out there ready to do the bare minimum to change things and to recognize that a change should be made. And really, that is it. And if Americans can do that, that should give us hope. So that's it for today. Hopefully the issue I mostly talked about wasn't too controversial and people aren't ready to demand my arrest and execution or whatever people do after they're angry. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. And we're going to have an incredible IQ supplement later this week with topics that I did not get to address on this issue or on this episode because we just had one issue dominate the discourse on here. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.